Good morning, Roy.
Good morning, Roger.
Um, these three terms, neoliberalism, managerialism, and elitism, um, some may be familiar. Elitism, people are familiar with what that is, perhaps. But can you explain what those three terms mean and why they're important in the context of your question of super-competent democracies and how they can replace this triumvirate of terms?
I think the important thing to do is to understand that you have an enemy. 99.99% of the people have an enemy, and it's called neoliberalism. But they don't know that it's there. They think their enemy might be Thatcherism or Blairism or whatever, or even people on welfare. But the big enemy of the whole of the human family is what's called neoliberal thought collective. And that infests every part of our government, every part of our education, every part of our media, everything throughout the world at the moment. And it's been an extraordinary process. And there are the fact that almost everybody in government, the current row with Jeremy Corbyn in the Labour Party in England, of course, is because he's not a member of the neoliberal thought collective, whereas almost everybody who's an opponent of him and who is so angry with him and so dismissive of him are. And what you find is that, in fact, if you want to change society, if you want a better society, if you want to have fairer, more just, more sustainable societies, a more competent society, then the obstacles in achieving that are primarily neoliberalism, but also elitism and managerialism. And again, those are terms which hardly anybody talks about. Mm-hmm. You ask somebody, do you know what I mean by neoliberalism? And a highly intelligent person with 2 degrees will say, is it to do with socialism? No. So you get into that situation. So we need, part of the purpose, if we can, we need to introduce people to this term and show them why it is their enemy. And it's as much their enemy as the Nazis were to us in the last World War.
Right. So how does neoliberalism relate to capitalism, which, say, people like me who come instinctively and culturally from the left, and I would say, be distrustful of capitalism and might focus on that. People from the right may focus on socialism or whatever. Where does neoliberalism act against the interests of, those two sort of instinctive enemies?
Yeah. Capitalism can coexist really quite comfortably with quite high levels of democracy. Mm-hmm. As it did, for example, when there was the collapse of capitalism in the 1930s. And Franklin Delano Roosevelt, the American president, rescued capitalism by increasing the amount of democratic institutions in the United States, as happened with us after the Second World War. We had a much more democratic society then than we have now. Mm-hmm. As we increased people's possibility of getting good education, good health services, and so on and so forth. And so capitalism isn't ideologically against a good health service. Mm-hmm. Neoliberalism is ideologically against a state health service. Absolutely. It is for neoliberals, there is an ideology. For capitalism, there is a way of doing business. Mm-hmm. It's a way of making money. It's not an ideology in the strict sense. Whereas neoliberalism is a very comprehensive theory of everything, whether it's a theory of government, it's a theory of economics, it's a theory of human relationships, it's a theory of education, etc., etc. So within the whole neoliberal collective, it covers all those bases, and it's enormously well funded. It has perhaps actively, I don't know, in the United States, the whole neoliberal project is funded to the extent of about $500 billion a year.
I read that earlier, and it quite took my breath away.
Just in the United States, let alone in Latin America and Europe and so on and so forth.
Not to mention then the funding of the actual campaigns of politicians outside of
the propaganda. And so that if you want to be a president or a prime minister, you better be an active member and part of the approved list of people by the neoliberal thought collective.
Many people will have heard of the Bilderberg group.
Yeah.
People that would perhaps be attracted to watch a video such as this. Others won't be. Is there a connection between the Montpellier Society and the Bilderberg group, or in terms of this thought collective idea?
Well, after the Second World War, we had to do a bit of history. The general spread of social democracy, with lots of welfare, public health services, public education, public universities, and so on and so forth, where people could get all of those free through the taxation system, was anathema to a fairly small group of American, European economists and commentators, people like Walter Lippmann and Friedrich von Hayek and so on. And they set up this group specifically to attack what they called socialism, because they said this was the way to tyranny, and that the only thing that guaranteed a free society was by allowing the market to take effectively to manage all the problems, because it was impossible for a government to handle the complexity effectively. It would actually become more and more tyrannous as it tried to manage the complexity. So the market, because the market is everywhere and nowhere, it can manage all of that. It's a fantasy, of course, and it goes all the way back to the 18th century and Adam Smith and the physiocrats. But it's neoclassical economics, but they call themselves neoliberals. But that small group of about 30 to 40 people attracted a lot of funding from American millionaires. And even so, and British millionaires, and even so, it wasn't until the 1970s that they really got their act together, when the American Chamber of Commerce suddenly got behind them, said this is what we're going to support, and we formed a huge collection of about 80% of American capital weighed in behind, so that the neoliberals never tried to form a political party. What they did was to find sympathetic politicians which they supported to gain power and so on. So Margaret Thatcher was sponsored by the whole neoliberal movement. Keith Joseph and so on and so forth. And so Ronald Reagan,
Tony Blair,
etc. And of course, a key part of the neoliberal movement is the mass media, is the mainstream media, and that includes almost everybody. I mean, even the so-called progressive media, like the New York Times or the Guardian, are essentially singing off the neoliberal hymn sheet, with one or two exceptions in their roster of journalists. So it's almost impossible now to have a discussion about where society goes without it being dominated by neoliberal ideas about free markets, about the lack of efficiency of public services, the efficiency of private provision, the need to privatize and to reform our public sector. And that is the way in which they have drained the state of its resources and passed them over to its rich friends, to the so this is why in 30, 40 years ago, the chief executive of a corporation would be earning, let's say, 70 or 80 times what his employees were earning. Now that same chief executive is earning 450 times what it is. And that's neoliberalism at work. That is the neoliberal model being played out. And so as we have austerity at the moment, that is a classic neoliberalism.
Austerity for everybody else, but not for them.
Oh, of course not. Yeah, that's right. Corporate welfare is going strong. So in order to remedy the faults that we can see all around us, whether it's in the social sphere, whether it's in the economic sphere, whether it's in the military sphere, whether it's in the ecological, environmental, sustainability sphere, we have to tackle neoliberalism, and we have to be aware of its dangers and its cunning. I mean, the mere fact that hardly anybody knows this term. You know, so you go to a book group, you know, you'll be reading something, and you say, this is an interesting example of neoliberalism at work, and you know, your friends will say, and they've all got degrees, they've all got all got good careers and whatever, been through, members of the Labour Party regard themselves as radical and so on and so forth, and they say, neoliberalism, what's that about? Yeah. So that's part of the extraordinary success of the process.
Going back to the last election in the UK.
I'm sorry?
Going back to the last election in the UK, where there were all the debates that were on the TV and what have you, I think I saw 2 mentions of neoliberalism in the whole of those debates, and they were in passing. One was from the Scottish National Party, Nicola Sturgeon, and the other one was Leanne Woods from Plaid Cymru. I think you find that those are the only 2 people that mentioned it, and only twice in all the. I watched all the debates, and it doesn't really. Well, it doesn't get mentioned. No. I think I have heard Jeremy Corbyn mention it when he's been interviewed. Of course, so now we've identified this combatant, Roy, this neoliberal ideology, and if we look, we find it within all the institutions and you know, corporations. You know, where power lies this neoliberal ideology. When did it all start to go right for them?
Yes. Well, if you remember, I said that they started with with this meeting of 30 or 40 people in 1947 at a place called Montpellier in Switzerland. Americans, Germans, English, economists, and political theorists. And they formed this Montpellier Society, and it has formed the sort of heart of a Russian doll model. So at the core of it is this Montpellier Society, which has now grown to about 200 or 300 people, and that meets every year, and that will include, I mean, people like Jeffrey Howe, the Chancellor of Germany, the Prime Minister of Greece, and so on. Not the current one, but the previous one. And so that you've got lots of prime ministers, ministers of finance, and so on in the Montpellier Society. And then outside of that, you've got a whole range of the funders, like the foundations from the United States, the core foundations, the beer money. And they then fund another layer of think tanks, which connect into universities, which connect into MBA business schools, which connect into journalism, which connect into television, which connect into radio, which connect into publishing, which connect into journals and so on and so forth, and then conferences. And on the outside of that, you've got the poor benighted public who see only the external, the immediate characters. They'll see, you might, if you remember, Milton Friedman was really quite famous in The Monetarists, but only because Margaret Thatcher was a friend of his. And so they do all of that, and on the very outside of all of that Russian doll model are politicians. They might be members of the core group of the Montpellier Society, but the vast majority of politicians who are part of the neoliberal project are just doing their job as politicians. Only everything that they do is informed by and supported by the other layers of the Russian doll, whether it's the think tank, the Institute for Economic Affairs, the Adam Smith Institute, the Heritage Foundation, thousands of them, thousands of these bloody think tanks, supported by corporate money, and sometimes governments. I mean, the Thatcher government would do, for example, gave an enormous amount of money to, not that the Conservative government, when Eastern Europe collapsed, the Soviet regimes collapsed, all of these think tanks, neoliberal think tanks, were funded to go and quote unquote help the Eastern European societies to become free market regimes. And so neoliberalism was imposed, you know, like a fiat on them. And so this is why, you know, the life expectancy fell by 10 years in Russia.
Was that under Boris Yeltsin after the wall came down? And
also, the neoliberalism has got institutions like the World Bank, NAFTA, the World Trade Organization, the IMF. All of those operate on neoliberal ideology. So if you need if a government needs a loan of a few $1 billion from the IMF, then the condition for that loan is that they stop funding health services, that they privatize the health service.
Currently, people may be aware of TTIP. Yes, obviously there's TIP.
Neoliberalism on steroids.
Right, I thought it might be.
It's the worst.
So looking at democratic processes, the European elected parliament of MEPs delayed the vote on TTIP, on when they should continue to negotiate it, because they were going to, I think they were minded to say, no, we're not going to negotiate that anymore. Perhaps there we see this conflict between our idea of democracy and our policy. We send them in to represent our interests, and when they do, they'll kick it into the long grass. And
it's been commented on how similar the people who are standing for election in the UK are. When you look at the leaders of the Labour Party, leaders of the Tory Party, leaders of the Liberal Democrats, for example, in the last election, they were all planned clones, weren't they? Apart from Jeremy Corbyn, his three main opponents are sort of cloned with each other, aren't they?
Well, Corbyn was kept in the background in the election.
That's right. He was
and they didn't even want to put him on. They didn't even want to put him on the ballot of this leadership election. Perhaps we're finding out now why.
So what has happened over the last 30 or 40 years is that the differences between the politicians, the people who you can elect, the people who you're able to actually cast a vote for, there's so little difference between them.
Yeah. In
their backgrounds, in their education, in their families, in their culture, in their leisure activities, and the places they go on holidays to.
Yeah.
I mean, the number of British politicians who holiday with American politicians.
Yeah.
And American millionaires and British millionaires. You know, I don't know where Miliband is on his holidays, but I was remembering that Gordon Brown used to holiday, and probably still does, in New England with members of the Clinton cabinet, with Lord Hollick, millionaire. Jon Snow. If you want to go on holiday, see Jon Snow in August, then you go and find him with having a holiday on the beach in New England with his friend Gordon Brown.
Yeah.
And their families, and watching.
Yeah, Peter Mandelson was a famous tart for
Exactly.
for a nice yacht.
So this universality. So what has happened is that what you've got now is this world club, this thought collective, who essentially are undistinguishable from one another, and they share the same assumptions, the same background, the same thinking around all the major issues of our time, and it essentially is neoliberal thinking. To counter it, hence my putting out the idea of super-competent democracies, we need something which is not a kind of attempt to recreate the Labour Party of the 1940s or go back to before Tony Blair. We need something which equally people can get can come to, where they can develop a shared set of assumptions around how we create increasingly just, sustainable and competent democracies from this point on. But in order to do that, in order to have the kind of competences, the kind of democracies that we need, the kind of sustainabilities that we need, the kind of equalities that we need, the kind of education and health and other systems we need, we have to first of all understand that our big enemy is neoliberalism and all of its works and all of its representatives, no matter what apparent political party or newspaper they belong to.